Look, I went into this show with such high hope. The marketing, everything I'd seen about this show prior to sitting in my seats looked absolutely fabulous. My excitement to see it had been built to like an all-time high. It was going to be the highlight of my week. And then I get to see it and I'm just left feeling a little bit disappointed. So why do I feel so let down? Hello you lovely lot, and welcome back to a brand new stagey review here on my theatre themed YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Flora, self-proclaimed theatre fan and part-time dabbler in being a theatre critic. Today we are talking about the brand new musical, Why Am I So Single, to see just exactly what I thought about it. I would like to make it very clear before we dive into this that all thoughts and feelings shared in this video are 100% my own. I'm coming at it from a position of extreme subjectivity and speaking honestly about my genuine thoughts and feelings on the show. Of course, please feel free to disagree with me and share your own thoughts and feelings in the comments, because I know no two people are ever going to watch the same musical and take the same things away from it. But with that in mind, let's explore why exactly I think I feel so disappointed by Why Am I So Single. I do think before we start proper, I should give you a little bit of context as to Why Am I So Single as a show, to kind of bring you up to speed and clue you in a little bit as to what the show is about and the process in which it came to be. Why Am I So Single is a brand new musical from the same duo that brought us Six the Musical, so Toby Marlow and Lucy Moss. The show takes us into the world of Oliver and Nancy, two best friends in their 20s who are spending the evening trying to work out why exactly their love lives are going nowhere. Oh, and at the same time they're also trying to write a musical but have no idea what their musical is going to be about, which is kind of a difficult thing when you're trying to write a musical. We follow these two best friends as they explore their failed romantic ventures and discuss how they can find love, whilst ultimately realising that their night of drinking Prosecco on their sofa and moaning about boys would actually make the perfect plot for a musical. It is currently playing at the Garrick Theatre in London, with tickets booking through until February 2025. So you have plenty of time to snag a ticket and check it out for yourself. Why am I still singing? Up to speed with a little synopsis of the show, let's dive into what I really thought. Oh, and really quick, this is definitely not going to be a spoiler-free review, so if you're someone who is keen to avoid spoilers until you yourself goes and sees the shows, maybe save this video for later and come back once you've seen the show so that you can truly appreciate what I'm about to say and maybe share your own thoughts and feelings on the matter as well. Right, now that's out of the way, let's dive into the good. Now, it goes without saying that the cast of this show is fantastic. I know I always start every review this way, but I do feel like it's a good opportunity for me to remind people that the review of the show itself is not a reflection on the cast involved in the show. 9 times out of 10, a cast isn't what leads to bad reviews, merely the material the cast are working with. Obviously, we have to give a shout out to the two leads, Lisa Tully and Joe Foster. Their voices were gorgeous and their chemistry on stage was really genuine. I do feel like they were quite a treat to watch interact with one another. They're playing two best friends, so naturally their friendship had to be believable. Standout performers to me were actually the ensemble. I think they were honestly the best part of the show. From their roles as household furniture to disco dancers to people at a club, I feel like they all had opportunities to shine as individuals as well as a collective. Everyone brought their own energy and comedy to the role, which was a joy to watch. I also feel like I'd be remiss to not point out how good the marketing has been for this show. I think that's partly why my expectations were so high going in. I'd seen clips of rehearsals, I'd seen people from the press launch. Everything was hyping this show up and building it up and getting me ready to sit down and go and see it and really love it. And so I think, you know, it goes without saying that the marketing team definitely need a raise, because they've done a stellar job. Perhaps too good of a job, to the degree of I was built up to here only to be delivered down here, but we will get to that in just a second. That is the end of a very short good section. Now, if you've watched any of my other reviews, which I highly recommend you go and do, by the way, you will know that normally the good section for a show is a lot longer than this. But I'm gonna show off my script here. This is the whole good section. The rest of this is everything else I have to say on the show, which should clue you in as to how I'm feeling. But as I said at the start, I want to speak honestly and speak my truth about how I feel about this show. And whilst I know my opinions and feelings on it are not going to match everybody's, I have thoughts and feelings and I want to share them. So with that very short good section out of the way, what do you say we get into the bad? The first thing I want to talk about in this section is definitely going to be the relatability of the show. Now, I don't know if you guys are very aware of how this show is being marketed, but there is a lot of focus on this being the West End's most relatable show, which is a bold claim to be making, and I just personally really struggled to connect with it on that relatable level. Whilst the marketing suggests the themes of the show are a universal experience, and therefore relatable to everyone, I do feel like the show makes several broad assumptions about what constitutes your early 20s experience. Firstly, the show presumes a shared experience of love and heartbreak that may not resonate with everyone. While many people can relate to the highs and lows of romance, the way these themes are portrayed throughout the show I don't think are going to align with everyone's personal experience, but they're portrayed in such a specific way that even though you can relate on some level, you're ultimately left feeling unable to connect. Secondly, there's this underlying assumption that everyone is eager to avoid being single, which at the very least for me is not reflective of many people's attitudes towards relationships and independence. Not everyone views being single as this horror and something that must be avoided at all cost, which is very much how it comes across as the characters' perspectives in the show. Like, being single to them is something undesirable and something to be feared almost. And additionally, I think the show assumes that everyone has like this one single irreplaceable friend that they can go to with everything, and that just I don't think is true for a majority of people. Maybe I'm speaking too much to my own experience here, but relationships and friendships come in so many diverse forms that to market the show as relatable and then only really show one type of relationship, I think is quite shallow. Like, I'm in my early 20s, I've experienced heartbreak, and I've certainly spent time drinking wine on my friend's sofa, moaning about boys. So it's reasonable to assume I should have every reason to connect with this show and relate to it on almost every level. But despite these similarities, I really found it hard to find myself reflected in the story that was being told on stage. Whilst the show's depictions of the struggles of online dating and being ghosted are definitely very relevant in the modern dating scene, the show I think just failed to capture the full range of experience associated with these issues. Moreover, speaking to the relatability part of this show is giving the guideline of a 14+ rating, and I just find it worth questioning whether the content is truly accessible and relatable in the way that the marketing material certainly claims it to be. I personally think it is a very bold move to market your show as the most relatable musical ever if the content of your show can only really resonate with a very specific group of people. I'm trying so hard not to make this become this massive moan fest, because aside from relatability, something I really struggled with in this show was the overuse of jokes and punchline. The humor of this show felt really lost on me. Humor is inherently subjective, right? I fully understand what resonates with one person and is hilarious to them may not resonate with someone else. However, much of the humor in this show felt forced and heavily labored. I personally think punchlines were repeated way too often, sometimes up to 3 times, and there wasn't enough space for the joke to breathe between the punchline being repeated. Whilst a joke might be amusing at first, I do think reusing the same punchline over and over again can quite quickly diminish the humor there. For example, the show has a joke about kissing frogs and having your membership to a wildlife park being revoked. It was all right the first time, but the repeated reference really quickly became quite tiresome, and I was like, oh great, we're talking about this again. Similarly, I think a lot of the gags in the show just didn't quite land. So the characters of Oliver and Nancy, as I said earlier, they are writing a musical, and so I assume we're meant to believe that they are theatre kids. And I think to the creative team, this justified the frequent use of musical theatre references. However, the constant nods to other musicals, particularly the musical Oliver, felt heavy-handed in places. And I find when such references are overused, they kind of go from a playful homage to musical theatre to something that's very gimmicky. And I really had to fight with myself not to roll my eyes the more it got used. I feel like this show could have done a better job of showing us that Oliver and Nancy are theatre people without the use of such overt musical theatre referencing. Like, instead of adding well-known riffs or lyrics from musicals, they could have actually chatted about musicals and, you know, have a Wicked poster up on the set in the background. Show me that they are theatre kids and really help sell that to me. Because since there was no other references to them being involved in theatre other than they're writing a musical throughout the show and these gimmicky references to other musicals, it made those references to other musicals feel like they were actually just because the writers wanted to include those references, like, you know, the Let It Go kinds of riffs and the big Wicked riff, like the Defying Gravity riff at the end. Like, that felt more like it was for the writers than for the purpose of telling us that Oliver and Nancy were passionate about theatre, if you get what I mean. And so that, combined with the fact that it was an overused gag, I think really started to grate on me. And look, I know I said it earlier, theatre isn't, not theatre, well, it is, but humour is incredibly subjective. And so whilst I didn't find lots of it particularly funny, I do think, you know, the people around me were clearly enjoying it. There is humour in it for some. Unfortunately, it just didn't land with me. I just think when the humour you're using in your show is so niche to you as a creative team, you perhaps forget that it might not have universal appeal. And so if everyone in the writing room is from similar social circles, a similar demographic, you're all friends, you've known each other a while, you're all gonna have a similar sense of humour. And so it kind of becomes an echo chamber of like, oh, is this joke really funny? Like, well, of course you think it's funny. You're all basically the same kind of person, but someone who's, you know, 10 years younger and from a completely different background from you may not find it as funny. And so yeah, some of it just really missed the mark, which was disappointing, but clearly other people around me were really enjoying it. And aside from jokes and punchlines not landing, another thing I think this musical really failed to do was actually just let the emotions of the characters sit. Like, Why Am I So Single is certainly not aiming to be the next Dear Evan Hansen or Next to Normal. There is no promise to deliver this deeply emotional show that leaves you in literal floods of tears. However, I don't think that means characters shouldn't be allowed the opportunity to explore these emotions and express them, certainly, or the audiences shouldn't be invited to feel these feelings alongside them. I think the most striking example of this for me is definitely the song Nancy sings about grief. Lisa Tully's performance was truly moving, and I would be surprised if there was a dry eye in the house. I think grief and the loss of a parent or the loss of anyone is something that most people can connect to on a really deep level, and to hear it expressed in such a lovely way definitely will have moved some people. However, this poignant song was sadly just used basically to set up the punchline of a daddy issues joke. I think this shift not only undermines the emotional impact of the song, which, like I said, was truly beautiful, but it also feels somewhat disrespectful to the audience who might have been really feeling and connecting with Nancy in that moment. Genuinely, she finishes the song, everyone's like, oh my god, that was amazing, and then Oliver just goes, so it was the daddy issues then. And it just felt really distasteful, particularly when you know that everyone in the audience is listening to the lyrics of that gorgeous song and really connecting with them. Whilst jokes about daddy issues can of course be funny, the timing of this just felt wrong. I feel like it's important for me to get across that it felt like there were some great moments of emotional depth that were ultimately overshadowed by this sort of burning need to get a joke in. And Nancy's song wasn't like an isolated incident. It happened quite a few times where we get glimpses of this authentic human being on stage in front of us who's exploring their own emotional complexities, just for it to be revealed that that was ultimately literally just a setup for a joke. I think the show could really benefit from allowing these characters to have these emotional moments and for those moments to be fully realised and appreciated. I know the tone of the show is one that's fun and silly and a bit goofy and ultimately just a good time, but I think you can still maintain that silly energy whilst giving the characters this space to emote. Their lack of an ability to acknowledge the emotional depth the character may have just gone to, I think ultimately diminishes the overall effect of having these scenes. Like, if you're not going to allow these emotional scenes that certainly the audience is really going to connect with the time to breathe, like if you're not going to allow them to sort of sit, what's the point of having them in the first place? Particularly if they are literally just going to be used as the setup for a joke. It feels immature and I think overall detracts from the impact that these moments could have. And I know we've just been discussing one song in the show, but I would like to discuss all of the songs as a collective. Marlo and Moss have discussed how each of the songs in the show take inspiration from a variety of other circumstances, being it the pop music they grew up with or musical numbers that you might find in these big grand musicals. And the reason they chose to play with all these different genres is because their characters are writing a musical and therefore have the freedom to explore these various different song styles. However, for me, it just didn't quite work. The songs often felt sort of disjointed and forced in, rather than flowing seamlessly. They felt more as though they'd been inserted to showcase different musical stylings. There was no real common thread between all of them, aside from, the people singing them. Additionally, all of them being references to other genres or styles of songs, I think really shifted my focus from the song itself to, this seems really familiar. What is it it's reminding me of? And on a more personal note within that, they do have this song about Ross and Rachel that is supposed to be inspired by early 2000s emo phase kind of music, and I am very much a fan of this music. I listen to it quite regularly. I went through a very severe emo phase, let me tell you. And so I was excited at the prospect of them including a song like this, but to include a song on this and effectively not deliver on it, I was really disappointed. Whilst I am by no means a musical expert, I do think there are very simple musical things that you can do within a song to make it clear that it is an early 2000s pop punk track, or to at the very least capture the essence of one. Literally listen to anything with Travis Barker on the drums and you will get what I mean. There is a very distinct drum pattern that tends to go with a lot of pop punk songs, and I think it is part of the core of the sound. I'm of the opinion that an electric guitar does not a rock song make, and I think this musical, particularly with that song, fell into that fallacy of, we've included a rock guitar, so it must be rock music, and it's hang on a minute. No. I know that's so nitpicky, but it is. If you're gonna play with different genres, particularly something as easily identifiable as early 2000s emo music, to the point where they included the emo accent, I think you really need to not half-arse it, which is what this kind of felt like. I would also like to say some of the songs went on for entirely too long or were completely irrelevant to the plot. I am very much of the opinion that if you are going to put a song there, it needs to advance the story forward. That's kind of the whole point of music in a musical. It drives the plot forward. It gets us somewhere. You could remove at least 3 of the songs from this musical and I do think it would ultimately be the same. We wouldn't have missed anything. There's no character development in them. There's no advancing the story forward. They're just songs for the sake of songs, and that really had me watching my watch Jesus Christ, is this song nearly over? Which I think is so disappointing because lots of the songs in isolation are actually really catchy. I know so many people, hell, even my PT Cody knows about this musical because some of the songs have come up on his TikTok page. 8 Dates, he's constantly humming that. I mean, hell, even I am, and I clearly didn't love this musical. Don't know if you guys got that. The songs are catchy and decent in isolation. I just don't think they work together. And speaking of musical numbers not advancing the plot forward, I'd also like to point out my gripe with the fact that this plot had no conflict. This plot had no conflict or stakes. And so I think that ultimately made the conclusion of the show really unsatisfying because ultimately there wasn't really anything to conclude. The conflict or the stakes is that the characters don't want to be single forever. And maybe it's because I'm coming at this at the perspective of being single literally is not the worst thing ever, which is kind of the opposite of what the characters are thinking in the show. But that's not really high stakes for me. There's no pressure for them to have a topic to write this musical about, not really. Or at least not consistently enough for it to feel like a threat that needs resolving by the end of the show. And their friendship, whilst there's a little bit of turmoil, never really gets tested in any way that makes the conclusion of, we've got each other, we love each other, we're actually best friends, I love you. Conclusion at the end of the show. It doesn't feel important or impactful. I know not every show needs this massive I hate you, you're the worst friend ever kind of argument. But those cliches exist for a reason because I think it really works. It's a good way to build conflict into your show, and when there's not really any conflict there or high stakes, you're left with very little to try and wrap up at the end, giving your audience a really unsatisfying ending. And speaking of unsatisfying, one of the really unsatisfying parts of this show has to have been the character development or lack thereof. I really struggled to connect with these characters, like I mentioned earlier, and I think a huge part of this is actually just their lack of development over the course of the show. I found it really difficult to connect with them because they were so flat and one-dimensional. Their portrayal seemed overly simplistic, revolving solely around their views for love, which ultimately dominated their personalities. and made them really one-sided. Nancy is depicted as someone who views love as like a band-aid for all of her problems. She's constantly chasing it, thinking it's the key to kind of unlocking her happiness. By contrast, Oliver is one of those people who fears never finding love, and so as a result, as his defense mechanism, he keeps putting up all of these walls and pushing away any advancements of love that come his way, just to avoid it altogether. And whilst their perspectives on love differ, their obsession with it, I do feel very much reduces them and their characters down to like a single trait. I wanted to see more depth and growth from each of them, or perhaps an acknowledgement that being single can be fulfilling and it's not totally the worst thing ever. Also that love can be found in various forms. It would have been refreshing to see Nancy and Oliver find joy and reassurance in their platonic friendship earlier, and perhaps also learn to relish in things outside of that friendship too, and realise that a huge part of love not only is there platonic love, but there's also self-love. Whereas it was quite clear that both the characters deeply had issues with themselves as individuals. The characters are predominantly defined by their desire to find romantic love, and I think this gives us very little room to learn about who they are as characters beyond that. We're given only fragments of their personalities in flashbacks, but all of that still holds the undertones of them being out trying to find love. So we get the story of how they met, but how they met was by basically being desperate on a night out to hook up with someone at uni. And so we never get this deeper understanding of who they are outside of their love lives. And I think that was ultimately disappointing because we never got to know who they were, and as a result never, or at least I certainly never, got to connect with them, because I want to connect with the person, not the problems they're experiencing, if that makes sense. And whilst the themes of romance and love and heartbreak are to a degree universally understood, the intense focus on this aspect of the characters and their lives, I think, lacked appeal to me. I do think to make the characters more relatable, there almost needs to be this element of self-discovery and self-love, and the opportunity for characters to grow outside of being desperate to have a partner to really help the audiences connect with them, because otherwise you are relying solely on the assumption that everyone's experience of love and being single is universal to help you relate to these characters. And leading on from that, I think because we never have this development of the characters, the message of the show, I think, is a little bit muddled and all over the place, and at the very least in the way I interpreted, missing the mark. The programme for the musical has a lot in it explaining how platonic friendship and platonic love are the core of this story. And stories centred around platonic love are indeed so valuable. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to watch a movie and it's been spoilt by the fact there's a lovey-dovey relationship in it when none was needed. But the way the writers present it, and certainly the way it comes across as them speaking about it in the segments in the programme, feels as though they feel like they're presenting something groundbreaking and new. And now I know that is me putting words in their mouth to a degree, but that is just how it came across. And whilst the framing of Why Am I So Single, particularly in the way it embraces queerness so unapologetically, which was lovely to see, is definitely a fresh angle to take when presenting a story of platonic love, I ultimately don't think it delivers on contributing anything to the conversation or saying anything more or anything particularly meaningful on the matter. Like I said, platonic love is undeniably important, but it's not a new concept to storytelling. The show doesn't seem to bring any new perspectives to the theme. I would also like to point out that in this show, the platonic love at the very end, or the realization that they have this platonic love for one another, very much feels like a placeholder for romantic love, at least in the eyes of the characters. It very much felt to me as though the characters were settling for the platonic love they had for one another, but there was this underlying tone of, but I still want to go out and get a boyfriend. But I'll settle for this for now, but I still want to get a boyfriend. This combined with the fact that the show does very little to develop its characters' understandings of their own relationships with love, as well as how happiness can come from sources beyond romantic love, I think makes this settling for platonic friendship at the end of the show less impactful. The ending where they recognise the platonic love they have for each other lacks the emotional depth it could have achieved if the characters had portrayed as truly and genuinely content with themselves and with their friendship. I wanted to pop on and say I've had a few other thoughts that I thought I would throw in here. One thing I do have to point out is that I really do think the language used in this show was a bit over the top. Now, at the time, I excused it as well. You know, Lisa, she's from Scotland, her character's from Scotland, the Scottish people do quite like to swear, but bearing in mind that this show has been given a 14 plus age rating, I think we need to look at some of the facts and figures. I know it's not directly comparable, but let's say a PG-13 movie movie, you are allowed to drop the F-bomb once, okay? And you're not allowed to be overtly vulgar and sexual in those movies, yet you're giving this a 14 plus age rating, and it feels like you're using the F-bomb literally over and over again, and to little effect. There are other words. Like, I'm not saying your character can't swear and that we need to be prudish about language, particularly when with younger people, bad language isn't being seen with such negative connotations. But I do think, particularly if you are targeting a 14 plus audience, you need to consider the fact that this 14 plus audience is going to be bringing 40 plus parents with them. And I think it's a really dangerous line to tread, because lots of people still do hold such language in really quite a negative light. The word became watered down, if you get what I mean. And so I think I just wanted to come on and say here, because it is actually a point I'd really like to get across, is that I think there was too much swearing in this. You can tell I'm editing, Flora, because there's my laundry in the background. Yeah, I thought I'd just pop in and put this little piece in as well, because I think it's important that it gets discussed. I know that was a lot, and sadly that is not the end of it. I obviously traditionally normally do my reviews breaking them down into the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I think what I covered in the bad may seem like a lot, and I think what I'm about to cover in the ugly is definitely a lot more personal, as opposed to a sort of critique of the story or anything like that. And so I do want you guys to take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt, as again, like I said, I know it is deeply personal. This review is literally just my opinions. Literally feel free to disagree with me. But I am about to dive into the ugly, and it's gonna feel really nitpicky, and I feel like it might feel like I've got a chip on my shoulder about something, but I genuinely cannot express like how baffled I am by some of the decisions made in this show, which have landed themselves in the ugly category, because a lot of it just sort of left a bad taste in my mouth, and I wanted to kind of put that out there before I dived into this, because I also want to remind everyone, like, I don't want this to be just like, you know, me boarding the hate train and slagging the show off. These are genuine critiques that I have of the show, and whilst my critiques are rooted in opinion, I also feel like it is something worth sharing, because I feel like perhaps I may not be the only one with these thoughts and feelings. But I just want like, I don't know how to phrase it, but I want to get across to you guys that this is not me just going on a massive negative rant because I didn't like the show. I have no vendetta against Toby and Lucy. Hell, you can probably tell by the gorgeous pins behind me. Six, the musical, I think is a masterpiece, and they are geniuses for having put that together. And I wonder perhaps if, because I had such high hopes, I feel even more disappointed. But yeah, please don't take this as me just hating on Toby and Lucy, and me more critiquing the material that I went to go and see, irrespective of who wrote it. That out of the way, I think it's time we delve into the ugly. One of the most frustrating aspects of this show was the overtly millennial tone it seemed to take on, which stretched beyond just the humour and found its way into the characterisation of the show as well. Despite being in my early 20s, like both of the characters are, I think I've made it clear to you guys now that I really struggled to relate to them. I am 22, which places me firmly in the category of Gen Z, though some might say Zillennial. Technically, I am a Gen Z, though I don't feel like it sometimes, and I found that the 20-year-olds being portrayed on stage were definitely millennials, not 20-year-olds my age. And I found that a very interesting direction to take, given that a lot of the marketing seems to be aimed at people my age. This is about to sound really harsh, and I know I keep talking about the characters and how I fail to relate to them, but I think a huge part of that actually is that they came across as very self-centered people and very prone to placing the blame for their love lives on external factors beyond their control. And they also kind of lacked an accountability for their actions. And this portrayal just evoked this very stereotypical millennial image in my head, where issues are attributed to external causes rather than any personal accountability being taken. I acknowledge this is a massively broad generalization of an entire generation, and that may seem unfair, but I do feel like it's definitely an opinion or a belief or a misconception, some might say, that definitely older and younger people than millennials themselves have about the millennials. Additionally, I do feel like the show relied way too heavily on millennial references and quirks that perhaps did not land with me because I simply didn't get them. References to shows like Friends and figures like Tracy Emin, who I literally had to Google. Turns out she's the woman that had that piece of work at the Tate Modern, which was just a messy bed. They felt misaligned with the audience the show was perhaps aiming for. The humour and the show itself felt very tailored to a specific cultural context, which if you weren't well versed in, it made it really challenging to appreciate, because a lot of it was just going over my head. I mentioned it earlier, but the show does also have a 14 plus age rating guideline, which does suggest that it is suitable for a relatively broad audience. But even at 21 92, I found a lot of the references baffling or ununderstandable, which makes me wonder if anyone under the age of 18 is going to have any clue as to what is going on, and perhaps, like me, would struggle to connect with the very period humour, shall we say. I know this show will definitely find a dedicated audience. I know this show will find a very strong following among a very niche audience, but I think this humour is partly what contributed to the lack of relatability, because I clearly sit outside of the niche that this show aims a lot of its humour at, and so it actually became challenging to watch, which I think highlights the disconnect between the intended appeal of the show and the broader watchability for a wider audience. And then aside from the fact I was really struggling with how millennial it was, this is going to sound like such a weird thing to say, but I just got such bad vibes from a lot of the jokes that were being made. It just felt like there were a handful of moments that lacked sincerity and just came off as ungrateful. There were jokes about this idea that, oh, well, they'll let anything on the West End these days, and several digs at Mamma Mia, which I always find distasteful, because I will have you know that over 70 million people worldwide have seen Mamma Mia, and it's the third longest running musical on the West End, having been running for 25 years. So, like, anyone that it just came across as whoever had written those remarks had a bit of a chip on their shoulder. This show, as a result, kind of adopted at points this high and mighty attitude, which was particularly striking if it aims to prove, which I think a lot of people are perhaps suspecting, that Six the Musical wasn't a fluke and that Toby and Lucy aren't one-trick wonders. I think such jokes just kind of came across as a bit out of touch with the broader theatre community and rubbed me the wrong way, certainly if... There were also a lot of jabs at the Garrick Theatre, which felt very in poor taste. Criticising the venue, including like, oh, you know, the riff-raff they let in the Garrick, they'll watch anything. It just felt misplaced, especially when you think about the fact that there are so many shows fighting tooth and nail for even half an opportunity to put their show on a stage somewhere at a much smaller venue, but don't have the opportunity to due to lack of space and funding and other barriers. The Garrick Theatre is where this show, Why Am I So Single, is making its debut. It has over double the capacity of the Arts Theatre, which is where Six the Musical made its London debut, and it takes a lot of money and a lot of backing and a lot of producer support to put on a show for the first time at this scale. I know it was workshop and all of that, but it never had like a small Fringe run, then a small London run. Like, it doesn't feel like, this sounds so dumb, it doesn't feel like it's earned the venue. I know that's not how it works, but that's how it feels.
Editing Flora here, hello. I just wanted to pop in and say that I was chatting with a bunch of friends, and I think I've actually realised that had I seen this show in a smaller venue or on the Fringe, I probably actually would have liked it a lot more. A lot of the humour is what I would consider Fringe humour, or at the very least some of the jokes and gags that did make me laugh. And so yeah, I just wonder perhaps had I seen this at a smaller venue where I feel like it would perhaps work better in a more intimate space, my opinions on it might be honestly quite different. Bearing in mind the whole show as a general rule is set in Oliver's living room, maybe giving it the setting that is a lot smaller and a lot more intimate would work better in an actual smaller venue. Just a thought.
And so it felt particularly off-putting for a show to come into such a prominent venue and make these kinds of jokes, dismissing the significance of being able to debut a show at such a venue, kind of casting aside the significance of the space and the audience that they've been able to attract. Like, I know it's such a weird thing to critique about a musical, like, what do you mean bad vibes? But I'm genuinely just being honest about how I feel, you know, having had time to digest how I feel about the musical and what I thought of the show, and I just could not shake this feeling of, like, smugness that was just off-putting. So there you have it. I know this perhaps wasn't the most glowing review of a musical. I don't think I've ever had so much, not negative, because I genuinely believe that a negative review is not a bad review, because a negative review doesn't set out to be mean. And I do hope that's not how I come across in this video. I don't want anything I've said in this video to be misconstrued as me hating on this musical. I know this musical is going to have a really passionate and dedicated fan base, and unfortunately I won't be in it, but that's not to say this musical doesn't have a place for a certain audience. I think it had a lot of promise. To me, it felt as though all the puzzle pieces were there, except someone had mixed 3 puzzles together in one box and then given it to me and said go. It almost feels as though it needed a little bit more time, perhaps to start out smaller, to get some test audiences in and to genuinely get some feedback from a really diverse group of people. And I know not every musical aims to appeal to everyone. I perhaps feel like the appeal of this musical is focused on a very niche audience, and so I do worry for the longevity of this. I definitely don't think it is going to have the success that Six the Musical had, and I do feel bad for Toby and Lucy to a degree. There must be immense pressure on them to have this be this massive success. They certainly, at least from what I have read about them and things like that, didn't set off in life to go and become musical theatre producers. They were at school studying English. They were at Cambridge studying English, or at least I know Toby was, not sure about Lucy. So they clearly didn't, dream of being these big West End producers, and then they have this huge success, this phenomenal success with something like Six the Musical. And suddenly that's the world they're thrust into. You've got to be empathetic to the fact that there is immense pressure riding on this show. Unfortunately for me, it just didn't hit the mark. I know a lot of people are going to love it. The people sat in front of me when I went to see it were having the time of their lives. This show clearly really resonated with them. And so I don't think you should let the review of just me alone sway you on whether you should go and see it. I do genuinely think everyone should go and give this show a chance, particularly because it is one of the cheaper shows on the West End at the moment, and there are elements of good fun. So if you're looking for something cheery to watch, this is definitely a good option for you. Do I think I will give the show a second chance? Possibly. I do know rush tickets are available for it, so if I don't have to spend too much money, I might go check it out again and see if my opinions have been changed, because I've been very transparent, certainly on my TikTok, that some shows you do have to sadly go see more than once if you are able to before you realise you really like them, and Juliet was a big example for me. So perhaps this could be another one that on first watch I didn't love it, but then when I know what to expect, I go in and love it the second time. So that remains to be seen. But as I said at the start of the video, if you do have your own thoughts and feelings about this musical, do share them down below in the comments. I would love to have a chat with you guys about what you truly thought as well. Am I the only one that's just a little bit underwhelmed by it all and struggled to connect with the characters? Perhaps you loved it. Perhaps this really spoke to your truth. Share all your thoughts and feelings down in the comments below. If you are looking forward to some more stagey reviews, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss out. Like this video. Whether or not you liked what I had to say about the show, it'll really help me to know that you guys are enjoying these reviews, and it'll help me keep making them as well. But that is all I have to say on the matter. I am sorry it was a vastly more negative video than I've made in the past, but I do hope that my negativity is seen as constructive criticism as opposed to blatant hate, because that is not how I want this to come across. Remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Remember to stay stagey, everyone. Bye!